Just a quick warning, this episode contains some strong language, so be advised, shit's about to get real. Making a film is like building a boat in the middle of a storm while you're already in the middle of the ocean. I heard that quote a while ago and it really resonated with me. I'm not sure who to attribute it to. It sounds maybe like a Werner Herzog thing. Throughout Make This Movie, you'll get the story of how my team and I produced a feature-length narrative film for just under $12,000. I'm Chris. I wrote, produced, directed, and edited Counterintelligence. Talk about saving on labor costs. Make This Movie is going to explore all of those processes and much, much, much more in depth. In this episode, we start where most narrative films do, with the seed of the story and how it grows into a script. But not just any script, the right script. A script that can be made for just under $12,000. Little muss or fuss. Granted, I initially thought it would cost about $6,000, but you'll hear about that in a later episode. Coming up, you'll hear about writing our first draft in 9 days, reverse engineering the script for successful production, and you'll hear from a few people who I trust because they tell it like it is and help pick apart my stories in a way I might not be able to. If you do as I did while following along with this episode, you may have your own first draft nearly done by the time the next episode comes out. Not bad, right? But before we start writing, let's jump to the middle of production, early on in Counterintelligence's journey.
We shot for 12 hours last night. From 7:30 we were on set until about 8:30, 9 in the morning, maybe 9:30.
That was me. Sorry for the audio quality. It was recorded on my phone while driving, through a headset, of course.
It was long.
It's an excerpt from an audio diary taken the day after a grueling 12-hour overnight shoot.
Pretty mind-boggling. And the fact that we're now officially 3 days through a 7-day feature film shoot.
You heard that correctly. We shot Counterintelligence in 7 days. Much more on that as the episodes continue, but you probably noticed in the diary, I sound exhausted, because I was.
It was very long. On one hand, I feel happy that we got the essentials, and the essentials we got are really strong. I also feel like, for the most part, people maintain their focus.
I'm not sure I ever expected to get that tired and beat down.
That was particularly hard for me, and that was the thing I was most worried about for myself. Probably the thing I put the most time and effort in.
I totally should have. That's filmmaking. That's indie filmmaking. I've done it before, and I'll do it again. You'll hear this clip evolve over the course of Make This Movie, but I wanted to introduce it here to illustrate where we're headed. The process was fraught, and many filmmakers will completely understand this. It was incomparably gratifying. Every day that I put into this movie was one of the happiest days I could have asked for, and I wanted that happiness to be contagious. I wanted it to spread to everyone I was working with, and I hope on some level it did. And I also hope that on some level it spreads to you. Even when we dealt with money problems, long days or long nights like the one you just heard about, even when we were chasing sunlight or running from it, I felt an incandescent joy. And I hope through all of it, you'll get it all here, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I hope you feel the same way. Ideally, you'll walk away that much more prepared to make the movie you need to make ASAP. That's the goal, to inspire you, to prepare you and demystify some intimidating parts of the low and micro-budget filmmaking process. So here we go. Let's make this movie. But first, we need to write this script.
A free film. For no money, for no anything. Half of the battle to make a good film in the United States free film. When I say good film, it's a free film. Whether it's good or bad, we don't know. But we'll put a year in for no money, for no anything. Simply because there's an expression that has to be said. Now, we don't have any reverence for this expression. We don't believe it's a church. We have to have a good time, otherwise we die. I mean, how much does this cost? You know, paper to do the hard work, and how much does reels cost? We get it all from the major studios. They help us destroy them. That's the way we work. Because if we make a good film, they will only suffer. And as they suffer, they come and they say, please make films for us. And we say, no, we don't want to make films for you. Hip, hip, hooray.
So to start off, every narrative film, short and feature, has to begin in one place, with the seed of a story. I'll try to speed through how the story came about and skip ahead to the meat, the script writing.
Joe Turner. Listen. Identification?
What?
Identification. My name is Turner. I work for you. Now listen.
Identify yourself.
I don't...
What is your designation?
Condor.
So I'm sitting on my couch one afternoon, and I'm watching a movie I've seen probably 5 times. It's 3 Days of the Condor, directed by Sidney Pollack, starring Robert Redford and Faye Dunaway. Again, I've seen this movie multiple times, and it's one of my favorite spy films of all time. But on this 5th or so viewing, something really jumped out at me that I guess I always kind of took for granted.
You have a lot of very fine qualities.
What fine qualities?
You have good eyes.
How is it that this raving lunatic, no matter how handsome he is, abducts a woman at gunpoint, and then within 24 hours, they're having a romantic relationship?
And they don't miss anything.
It didn't make any sense. I know a lot of women, and I don't know a single one who would even go down that road with somebody without a gun who just ranted at them. This guy's a paranoid schizophrenic. He's talking about government conspiracies. Spoiler alert, he is a part of one. And he forces her to take him back to her house at gunpoint. How could a romance evolve from that, particularly within 24 hours?
But you're overdoing Vermont.
So I did the thing that I promised I wouldn't do. I picked up my laptop, I opened my screenwriting software, and I started typing. I typed all the way through the credits, and probably for a little while after. And by the end of that little session, I had about 12 pages. And it was solid. I enjoyed it. It was good dialogue. It was my revision of what the abduction would look like in 3 Days of the Condor in real life. In the movie, they cut from the abduction itself, where Redford holds up Faye Dunaway at gunpoint, gets in her car, to her house. I was curious what would happen in that car, so that's what I had written those 12 pages about. Anyway, it was intriguing, and immediately after, I did what I always do when I write something that intrigues me. I gave it 2 days to marinate, to see if I still kept thinking about it. Was this something I was going to continue obsessing over until I just had to let it pour out of me onto the page? Sure enough, a couple days later, I had come up with I started filling in all the blanks in my head until they just had to come out. And then I made a productivity decision. It's one that I make quite often when I commit to writing a script. And this is where it gets really important for efficiency purposes. If you really want to get a script done, get it out there, you have to keep writing. I find the best way to keep writing is to set goals and milestones for myself. I know that sort of feels like it takes the creativity out of it, but if you structure your milestones and goals correctly, it actually opens up huge doors for your creativity. By setting certain parameters for yourself, it allows you to play within those parameters and get the most out of what you have to offer on the page initially. Now, the milestones that work best for me involve pages per day. Given very few restrictions, I can write a lot in one sitting. Doesn't mean that even half is that good, but I can just write a lot. You may be different, but knowing what I know about my own capabilities, I committed to writing 10 pages per day.
That's all. We play games. What if? How many men? What would it take? Is there a cheaper way to destabilize a regime? That's what we're paid to do.
Walk on.
The only stipulation to each day's writing, besides reaching 10 pages per day, was that I didn't think too much, was that I let whatever came to mind just pour out of me. Not in some religious or super spiritual sense, but just don't limit myself by what could happen or couldn't happen or might not be possible. Really, truly free writing within the parameters of the story. If I did that and wrote 10 pages per day with the ultimate goal of having a 90-page first draft, then by that math, I could finish my first draft in 9 days.
They're running out. Ask them when there's no heat in their homes and they're cold. Ask them when their engines stop. Ask them when people who've never known hunger start going hungry. You want to know something? They won't want us to ask them. They'll just want us to get it for them.
Have you found a home?
Once I outlined that with myself, I hunkered down and started writing.
You want that? I don't want that.
I'm sorry.
That's your job.
Lay him down.
Now I want you to tell Jane.
And I moved you and I checked your head and I moved you.
Hey. You're not right. No. Go!
Lo and behold, 9 days later, I had a printed first draft in front of me, weighing in at 91 pages. It was called Counterintelligence, and it's the story of an imbalanced, armed man.
Oh, yes. This isn't right. This isn't right. No, I'm not.
With a mysterious case who holds an overworked production assistant.
Here. Okay.
Can we call you with questions?
Sure.
Hostage.
Get in the car. Come on. Get in the fucking car now.
While being hunted by a driven agent and her inept team.
Ed.
Yeah?
We need to unfuck this. That's your job.
The imbalanced male character is named Abel, and the overworked production assistant is named Angela.
You have a phone? A landline?
Yeah, next to the typewriter.
So what eventually changed from the first draft? Well, a whole lot. Some aspects changed in production and post, like adding improvisational elements, which we'll deal with later. But all of that could really only work if the blueprint for the film, the script itself, was tight. Call that a lesson learned the hard way on my first feature. So most major changes, like how Angela was originally a guy named D'Angelo, and the agent pursuing Abel, Evelyn Goldwyn, was also originally a guy named Evan Goldwyn. Those changes happened in the subsequent 6 drafts of the script. Now it was time to turn myself loose on the revision process. Before I dive into how I specifically revised Counterintelligence, I want to talk about what I'm looking for throughout the revision process. I break it into 2 categories: story and production. Now, the second category, production, is really mostly relevant in the low and micro budget category. I suppose there's relevance in all categories. However, the lower the budget, the more you have to be thinking about production in the scripting phase. I didn't want to inhibit myself with that in the first draft, but in future drafts, I had to be much more attentive to how feasible this project would be on a micro budget. As far as the first category, story, I'm not going to go super deep into that because I know that there's a lot of podcasts and tutorials and much smarter writers than myself who outline their creative process for really fleshing out character and plot and the overall flow of the story. I have my own methods, which I learned from the giants whose shoulders we all stand on. So for the purposes of this podcast, I'm going to talk about assessing your revisions for production. The budget of the film you ultimately make really starts with the script that you have and the parameters you've set for yourself and your team on the page. My ultimate goal as far as assessing production in future drafts of the script was to reverse engineer the script for production success. Basically, how to construct the story for my budget and goals, which includes things like number of locations, cast size, props, etc. Minimizing the amount of factors in the equation is what keeps costs down. Now, I want you to keep that in mind as you approach your own script and the later revisions of it when you're thinking about production. Reverse engineering for production success. An inexpensive film starts on the page. Now, the main efficiency metric that I kept in mind, at least in the early drafts, was having very few locations. The fewer locations, the easier it is to just keep production rolling ahead without having to stop for long periods of time. In later drafts, I dedicated myself to paring down characters, merging them, and slimming locations even further. Also, I want to step aside for a second and talk about the concept of researching your script. In the past, I've gotten completely bottlenecked on research. It actually caused one of the longest periods of writer's block in my life. I got so obsessed with the research process. You can go down the rabbit hole and you can honestly never come out. On my first feature script, the research really fed the process, but in the future, I got so obsessed with the research that I couldn't even maintain solid writing habits. So for the purposes of this script, I really wanted to set out to write something that I wouldn't have to research at all, or at least would have to research very minimally so as to avert getting bottlenecked. Also, if you're thinking about doing something that you really heavily have to research, there's a good chance that there are a lot more variables than you can necessarily control for in production. So I would recommend sticking to stuff that you know that's fairly simple. Ultimately, as you're looking at other aspects of your script for efficiency purposes beyond just characters and locations, you have to know your limits. Know what you can physically execute from experience and write around that. I know that there are certain things that I can maneuver and certain things I can't. From the years that I've spent making commercial work, making creative work, and spending a lot of time behind the camera, in post, and working with other people. So it's pretty easy for me to impart a lot of that experience on my revising process of the script. You kind of have to do the same for your own experience. Be honest with yourself. Know what you can and cannot do on a certain budget, on a certain time frame. And if there's anything in your script that's questionable, your best bet is to take it out and either replace it with something that'll work better or see if it can just go altogether. So I wanted to share some general rules and things to look for as you're revising your script for efficiency. These are some key points that I looked through throughout the revision process and where they landed me. The first item, I mentioned it earlier, having fewer locations, which equates to less jumping around and logistics. The final film, Counterintelligence, had 15 locations, which isn't a lot. It's also not too few, but the vast majority of the movie takes place in a single location. So most of the scenes that I had to shoot in other locations besides that primary were short, with very few exceptions. And other locations outside of that consolidated a lot of the cutaway scenes. So for instance, most of the story takes place at the female protagonist's home, both before and after she's abducted.
How far do you live? Look, just answer me, okay?
Not that far.
Alone?
Alone, yeah.
But throughout the movie, we also cut away to the agents pursuing the male protagonist who's on the run from them. In writing those cutaway scenes, I tried to keep them to one office.
Oh, sure, I can do that, but I'm in my office. If you just want to scoot on over here, we could...
Phil?
Huh?
If I see your stupid bald face, I will put it through a wall.
And that ultimately made up most of a day of shooting. So by keeping most of the primary action to only a couple locations, and keeping other scenes shot at different locations short, it minimized the amount of hopping around that we as a team ultimately had to do, and allowed us to focus on shooting longer sequences of dialogue with some level of fluidity. The next item to look for while revising: fewer characters. Fewer characters means fewer actors, which means fewer rates. It also means fewer variables to shuffle around the board in production. You can really focus in on your primaries if you don't have a bunch of other characters around. Counterintelligence ended up with 12 actors, 2 principals.
I really have to go to the bathroom.
I heard. It's back there.
Yeah. Let's go.
No.
You're staying in my sight.
Look, I'm not...
No, I'm sorry. This is just how it is.
No, I'm sorry. I'm definitely not going in there with you. Are you fucking kidding?
A couple substantial supporters.
Crazy rises, stupid drowns. Why a fucking wetsuit?
I've just had a little bit too much coffee. Past my bedtime, kind of thing.
And then a few who dip in and out in small roles.
Just left to hang out. Saucy.
If I was you, sir, I wouldn't ask so many questions. You're now in the fold.
Just say, hey man, back off. I get it.
How you doing, my dear?
You a friend? I wrote you a check.
And I tried to make them all as memorable as possible while demanding as little time as possible in production. Most of our time and effort was put towards the principals. The next item is fewer technical demands like complex action or visual effects. This means a leaner crew and faster shoots and quicker post, So I limited the amount of VFX and counterintelligence to occasionally adding in a digital gunshot, some blood effects, but all were things that I knew that I could manage. I also factored in a green screen that went off without a hitch because I knew I could do it under the conditions that we had because I'd done it before. Every visual effect or complex sequence that you add adds time, adds money, and ultimately demands quite a bit from your team. So for me, the most productive thing to do was to only write in things that I knew that I could do alone, if need be. And they would only then go quicker with other people helping me out. So keep those kinds of things to a minimum, and you'll save yourself a bunch of time and money. Another thing that sort of happened by a happy accident, but ultimately ended up working, was keeping the time frame for the story short. This will equate to fewer costume changes. So Counterintelligence takes place in basically a 48-hour window, which means that the characters rarely, if ever, have to change their costumes. The male principal never really changes his costume. He does shed layers over time, but he's wearing the same garments throughout the entire movie. The female protagonist really only changes her costume a couple times.
I need some clean clothes.
I don't have any.
What, nothing?
No.
No one has ever left anything behind, ever?
No.
Keeping the time frame of the story short just takes another variable out of the equation and allows you to really focus up on what's important, good performances, and making sure that everything is checking out on screen. The next item is basing your story in the modern day, which means actors can wear their own clothes. If your genre demands crazy outfits like sci-fi or sports or something like that, then the odds of you finding actors with their own wardrobe are going to be that much slimmer. But by basing your film in the modern day, you can kind of count on your actors having their own wardrobe, which saves you a lot of money. And the final item to look for as you're going through your script and doing revisions, envisioning for locations you know. This one is absolutely key. If you've been working on low or micro budgets for a long time, even in shorts, you're probably really accustomed to this. But it ultimately helps quite a bit to center your story in places that you are super familiar with and know that you can access for prolonged periods of time. Bringing it back to the central location of Counterintelligence, the female protagonist Angela's apartment, we shot that in my apartment.
Anybody else home in the building besides that asshole?
I know that there are no limitations surrounding how I use my apartment. I've lived here for 7 years, I know all my neighbors, and I'm close with my landlords. So I was able to reach out to my landlords, say, hey, we're going to be doing this for the next couple days. I was able to put signs up for my neighbors so they were aware, asking them to also keep the noise down. Everyone complied, we all get along, and it was all a part of the plan to begin with. Focusing a lot of your story in spaces that you know you can access and use freely for as long as you need. And by the time the script is optimized to that point, I'm at about draft number 3. Enter the braintrust.
I don't remember this.
That's my friend Rachel.
I mean, I remember we... Go on.
So you just black out the awkward shit?
Maybe. That's my life, Chris. I can't black out my life. Or maybe I can.
It's weird having conversations with you because I keep picking up on weird tics that we share.
And that's my friend Mark.
I talk to myself a lot, especially in the shower.
Yeah, every fucking day. Yeah.
I consult the braintrust in batches, and they're not the only ones in it, but they're the key members. Basically, I have each trusted opinion in my life. Read the script a few at a time per draft. A few people will get to read an early draft, then a few will read a much later draft, and I'll compare. I also don't do them just one at a time. I do them in bundles. So I'll have a few people read the script, and I won't make any notes until I've received all of their notes, and I can compare for commonalities. This is also a really good efficiency tip because it helps you bundle revisions, so you're not jumping back and forth making a bunch of different notes from a bunch of different people, some of which might conflict. You're doing them all at once, and you can compare and contrast and figure out what works, what doesn't, what's important, what isn't. So I recommend getting 2 people in your life to read maybe draft number 3 after you've gone through it enough, and then 2 different people to read draft number 4, etc. Rachel and Mark read at 2 separate stages in the drafting process.
I remember thoroughly enjoying it. I remember, and we can talk about this a little more later, but I remember that the introduction to me could use a bit of streamlining, kind of jump back and forth all over the place, which I, enjoyed. But as far as establishing the characters were concerned, giving clues to who these people are in their day-to-day lives to inform the audience as to why they were making these particular decisions
it seemed really difficult for an outside reader, i.e. not myself, the writer, to truly understand who these characters were, what their motivations were, and just to kind of get to know them because we're quickly thrown into the action.
I remember imagining the main female character as pretty mousy, kind of, in my head.
Her erratic behavior seemed a little over the top.
Mark comes from a more artistic, creative background, and he's got a great ear and eye for story. He's a huge cinephile, as is Rachel. Rachel's opinion is very different, though, and this is why I go to her.
Your idea of what a woman is thinking isn't always going to be right, in the same way where I could never write a male character. Nope, not at all. So I would have to ask and trust the men in my life to give me, the inside scoop, and the fact that, like,
in Counterintelligence, women play a very prominent role. So it was important for me to filter these characters through an actual female perspective.
But it did feel like, she was just kind of like this beaten into the ground character, and it was like, why? Like, I wasn't really getting the why.
So there had to be some greater context applied there. And it had to happen early on, so you had a good understanding of who this person was and why her reactions to later situations when she's confronted by her kidnapper would even make sense.
We wanted to give the characters a reason to be acting erratic, like give them, not purpose necessarily, but something they could lose. And I since that wasn't in the script specifically, like there wasn't like any mention of any outside family members or anything that either of these people would leave behind.
Rachel was talking about character, which was really important to me. That's part of why I had her read it. And Mark was talking about structure and understanding characters in a broader sense, but really they were saying the same thing. This character's actions don't necessarily make sense in the framework and context of the story. Clarify it.
Nothing phases me anymore unless it's like a direct threat to the people I love or my finances or something along those lines. You know what I mean? Like, and maybe I was looking for that like primal survival protection. You know what I mean?
These are the types of things you want to compare and contrast to make your movie better. And on the topic of women,
she serves as a kind of archetype of like the Sheryl Sandberg.
Evelyn Goldwyn, the intelligence agent at the helm of trying to bring our main character, Abel, back in. Part of the entertainment factor in Counterintelligence is that Evelyn Goldwyn is spearheading this effort, and she's just surrounded by a bunch of idiots. There was one scene that Rachel honed in on in the script where Goldwyn has to confront one of these idiots who really royally screwed up. She just starts going off on this guy.
The caps would mean like talking loudly or yelling. It's almost like playing into the bad part of that person in the world, of where people think, successful women in business are like yelling and like over asserting their power, when I don't necessarily think that that's the case in most situations.
So as a man writing this character, that's the best type of note. I don't have the experience living under the social norms of being a woman. So to collect that kind of input made the character feel a lot more authentic.
I swear this is not a dream. Were you going to cast her originally, or were you writing her originally as a man?
Not only did I originally write Evelyn Goldwyn as a man, but I also originally wrote Angela, the main character, as a dude.
The dialogue could be exactly the same, but mean something totally different. And so, I would assume that if it was a man, it's him throwing his dick around, But with a woman, it's, her, reasserting her power and, having to do what she did.
Stability in the situation.
Exactly. Yeah. Let's have women in regular positions where it doesn't revolve necessarily around them being a woman, and to normalize it. But then if you're a male writer that starts doing that, you also can't just switch the name out. Right.
Busted. But this is the exact stage you want to be busted in. Mark, who also echoed a lot of the things that Rachel said, also really helped me to dive into the nitty-gritty of the narrative structure. In Counterintelligence, the story just kind of starts. Like, we jump in, we're full throttle.
There are still a significant amount of cuts in the introduction now, but it plays much differently in the Dead Ben. It seems kind of scattershot initially.
It's like a 6-minute montage just sort of setting the stage. And Mark helped me really critically pick that apart to make sure it flowed. And certain things just were not flowing.
We're dropped into this very traumatic event, and we're not really, I mean, we hit the ground running. It really starts off with, massive cuts and setup. It just didn't seem to me that the frenetic pace jives necessarily with the threat that was involved.
He's talking about cutting back and forth between multiple set pieces and pieces of action, and they're all coming together in this big mosaic. And with stuff like that, it's really important to get a pace dialed in. And just as Mark helped me sort of iron out the opening flow and the introduction of different characters and elements and subplots, Rachel helped me really dial in how the movie wrapped up.
Am I being too, not critical, but type A? I'm I don't understand. Am I missing some detail that other people don't care?
When a type A person thinks they might be being a little bit too type A, those are notes that you really want to lean in and listen to. They're going to pick out some holes in your story that you might even know are there and have just been avoiding.
But that doesn't, you could still have it be very fuzzy and still get the gist of the movie and what you're going for.
There was a significant inconsistency, or at least one that I found was significant, that she identified that ended up causing me to rack my brain for about 2 weeks for a solution. Granted, the solution that I landed on ended up being super, super simple, but I knew the problem was there all along, and I just kept avoiding it in hopes that no one would notice. And she totally noticed.
When you watch a movie and you're like, damn, this was before cell phones. And if cell phones were invented back then, all the problems would be solved.
That's a common thing. That's something I know I've thought when I've watched certain movies. And if there's some technological inconsistency, you need it identified. And the earlier, the better. Because you don't want to get to production and have somebody say, what about cell phones? That's why these brain trusts and these notes are extremely valuable, and why it's really important to cultivate a really trusted group of people, the commonality being they can be brutally honest, they can be to the point, they're detail-oriented, and they have some appreciation for movies. They don't have to be filmmakers, but they have to be people who inherently understand story and really want you to make your best work possible. Thanks to the Brain Trust by Draft 7, I had more rounded, authentic, interesting characters, a story that, at least on the page, moved in a way that made sense, and that's the power of taking feedback. A lot of people don't take feedback because it's scary. Each of those characters is a representation of an aspect of your own personality or something that's important to you, something that you're working out. You've put some time, effort, and energy into crafting this piece, and to have people tell you that certain things aren't working, the instant impulse is to say, well, hey, back off. I can see how this will work in my head. But if your intention is for other people to watch the finished product and maybe get something out of it, it's crucial for you to take people's opinions into consideration. And what you can do with a good brain trust isn't tear down your world or turn it into something else that you didn't intend it to be, but they can poke significant holes in that world so no one else down the line can. When I first sent the script to Mark, my email had a little parenthetical that said something to the effect of, the title is temporary, obviously. Mark took some issue with that. And the title at that time was Counterintelligence.
I couldn't, I racked my brain for a while trying to think of, what would be a better way to summarize this and give people, a peek into it without, spoiling anything by any means, and speak of the plot. And I mean, it's perfect. And you don't fuck with perfection. It's the double entendre definitely helps too.
Once I hit a solid and workable draft, one that I was proud of and pleased with, I was ready to shop it around. And I don't mean that in the conventional way. I'm not shopping it around to producers, studios, or buyers. I'm ready to shop it around to collaborators and turn those final pages into a mission statement. Whoa, wait a second. I'm almost ready. But there's still that little issue of money. Where does money come from? Not in a grand philosophical sense, but where does movie money come from? Now, in the past, I've done equity finance, money from private investors, and crowdfunding. I've even made films for $0. But there's one place feature film money never came from before in my career. Me. My savings account, which is now empty. Do I regret it? Should I have gone another route? Absolutely not. Should you do the same if you can? I don't know, but you'll hear how and why this came to be, some other financing considerations a filmmaker can weigh, my experiences in the past, and how to build a budget based on what you have available on the next episode of Make This Movie. If you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen. While you're there, you could totally leave us a rating or a comment or both if you so choose. Those are easy ways to help spread the word to other listeners who like the same stuff as you. Music for the show comes from our film, Counterintelligence, and was composed by the great Noah Simons, who you can find on SoundCloud or Bandcamp as Larians, Larians, and his band, Male Blonding, on Bandcamp, iTunes, and Spotify. They're super good. Make This Movie is brought to you by Showhawk Media. If you're a filmmaker who wants even more useful info and tools, visit showhawk.com/makethismovie and sign up to access our free micro-budget producer starter kit, including template spreadsheets, documents, and other great stuff we covered throughout this series, ready for you to fill in the blanks. That's showhawk.com/makethismovie. Visit counterflick.com for more information on Counterintelligence, the movie, including fun stuff like our satirical fake news page. Also on Facebook is Counterintelligence, Twitter, and Instagram @Counterflick. I'm Chris Socker. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
That way you're taking all factors into consideration when looking at the budget. And quite frankly, when you're looking at post-production, you shouldn't just be looking at post-production. You should be looking at advertising. You should be looking at film festivals. You should be looking at travel. You should be looking at PR. So whatever you have in mind for post-production, you should double it.